Hello, everybody. Here, we'll be discussing The Monsters and the Critics, maybe the most famous essay on Beowulf ever written, and something J.R.R. Tolkien wrote long before he ever did The Lord of the Rings. To begin with, I think it's worth stopping for a second and ask ourselves, what is the point of studying monsters? Honestly, if you signed up for this course, you probably think that monsters, ghosts, and aliens are pretty cool. And actually, that's probably the number one reason to study these things. They're cool. They're interesting. They're in the stories that we like to hear or see or watch or read. And so I think the fact that monsters are cool is probably the number one reason to study them. But you can also study culture and people and understand those things better by studying the monsters that they create. Like when we analyzed The Hook, we learned about a slice of life in 1950s America, but we also learned about people today and why they might enjoy continuing to tell that particular urban legend. And likewise, with Grendel and Grendel's mother, we talked about that line that separates human beings from the monstrous. There's a lot of gray area there, but sometimes the creatures that get categorized as monstrous, they can seem very human. But cultures don't often act like there's a gray area. If you're unlucky enough to be placed on that monstrous side of the line, for example, it's okay to kill you. You're a monster. You do monstrous things. There's something weird or off or strange about you, and that makes you not us. So for the monstrous, there's no mercy. But this is a problem because what counts as monstrous varies so much from culture to culture. And that's another reason to study these kinds of things. Finally, we also talked about that vicarious thrill you feel at the breaking of a prohibition, of crossing a boundary, of doing something that's been forbidden. So there are a lot of different reasons to study monsters as they appear in books and movies, fairy tales, urban legends, whatever the case may be. The thing, though, is if you look at the history of how scholars have read the poem Beowulf, what you're going to discover is that they really thought the monsters in the poem were pointless. Medievalists only started officially studying Beowulf in the 19th century, not that long ago. And at the time, they didn't understand Old English all that well. So it took them decades to even get a strong handle on what the plot was. And when they finally did figure it out, they weren't impressed. Part of the problem was they kept thinking about Beowulf like it was an epic poem, an epic of the Anglo-Saxons. And so they kept comparing Beowulf to other major epic poems from other cultures, like the Iliad, the Odyssey from ancient Greece, the epic of Gilgamesh, the Finnish Kalevala, or the Mahabharata. There are all these cultures, all these nations, they had their own national epic. And that was considered the cool thing for a culture to have. And it was just assumed that the Anglo-Saxons had one too, which they called it Beowulf. But then you get this poem, Beowulf, when you start getting into its details. It is so odd in terms of its narrative, for all the reasons that we've previously discussed. It just, at the end of the day, it doesn't look like those other major epic poems that we just mentioned. So medievalists kind of dismissed its literary value. The Anglo-Saxons, they said, they just don't know how to write. They don't have good stories to tell. At the same time, these medievalists hastened to assure us that Beowulf was still an important poem because it contains a lot of history about ancient times that we wouldn't otherwise know. So that's how they studied Beowulf. They studied it as a historical document because it was such a lousy poem. It focused on the family genealogies, the battles, like during the celebration that follows Beowulf's defeat of Grendel. There, a poet tells the story of the battle between the Danes and the Frisians, where the lady Hildeburh's entire family dies. We don't have a lot of other sources for that. Beowulf is pretty much it, a couple minor ones. But medievalists studied Beowulf for its history. But in terms of pure poetry, they just didn't care for Beowulf at all. And that's where Tolkien comes in. He absolutely loved Beowulf. It was his favorite poem, and he thought it was the cat's meow. And, to boot, he was a medievalist at the University of Oxford. All his life, He hears about what a confused and confusing epic poem Beowulf is, so he decides to make a case for the poem's value. The central issue came down to the status of the monsters in the poem. In particular, Beowulf is responding to W.P. Kerr. He was this very well-respected medieval scholar, and he primarily complained that the Beowulf poet put the irrelevances at the center and the serious things on the outer edges. That is to say, on Kerr's point of view, the poem focused on the monsters when it should have been focusing on history and family genealogy. Why would a good poet waste so much time talking about fairy tales when he could have been discussing the Swedes and the Geats and the Heathobards? That's Kerr's point of view. But Tolkien, he thought that was backwards. And so what he had to do was make a case that studying the monsters in Beowulf is actually of central importance to understanding the poem. He has to defend the literary value of Grendelin the Dragon, and he's going to do so in a way that we haven't seen before yet in this class. In one sense, Tolkien admits that there's kind of just like a matter of taste involved. If Greek tragedy is your thing, the plays, Sophocles, Euripides, those guys, where a hero's downfall is brought about by one tragic flaw. I mean, that's Greek plays, but that's not Beowulf. There's no fatal flaw in the poem, nothing that Beowulf suffers. What the poem offers, though, and what Tolkien recognized, is that there's a sense of doom in the poem, a sense of inevitable defeat. Now, if you know Norse mythology, you know that Ragnarok is the final battle where many of the gods and mankind are fated to perish. Nonetheless, the gods and the humans, they don't give in to despair. That's what Tolkien calls his northern theory of courage. Heroes, despite knowing that they'll die, they continue to do their brave hero thing regardless. They fight on despite the unavoidability of failure. And that's partly why the monsters in Beowulf are so important for Tolkien. At the end of the day, the poem recognizes that the monsters are going to win. But heroes like Beowulf, while they yet live, they will continue the fight, the good fight. There is a doom that hangs over the head of humanity, and Beowulf is going to die. We know this, but he continues to be heroic and fight for his people all the same. That's just not something you see in any other major poem of the ancient world. So in our next section, we're going to go through the details of Tolkien's arguments about the Northern theory of courage, and a little bit more carefully. Also, we're going to look at Tolkien's argument for the basic structure of Beowulf, which also depends on the monsters. I hope you guys enjoyed. It's going to be fun.